Today's story is An Artist's Story by Anton Chekhov. Before the story begins, here is a brief listening guide. Written in 1896, and also known as The House with the Mezzanine, An Artist's Story belongs to Chekhov's mature period of restrained realism. Set on provincial Russian estates, it brings together debates about art, education, medicine, social reform, labor, and privilege. Listen closely to changes in weather, light, landscape, silence, and domestic sound. These details reveal emotional shifts that the narrator often understands only after the moment has passed. We will now begin the reading. An Artist's Story. It was 6 or 7 years ago when I was living in one of the districts of the province of T. On the estate of a young landowner called Bielokurov, who used to get up very early, wear a peasant tunic, drink beer in the evenings, and continually complained to me that he never met with sympathy from anyone. He lived in the lodge in the garden, and I in the old seigneurial house, in a big room with columns, where there was no furniture except a wide sofa on which I used to sleep, and a table on which I used to lay out patience. There was always, even in still weather, a droning noise in the old Amo stoves, and in thunderstorms the whole house shook and seemed to be cracking into pieces. And it was rather terrifying, especially at night, when all the 10 big windows were suddenly lit up by lightning. Condemned by destiny to perpetual idleness, I did absolutely nothing. For hours together, I gazed out of the window at the sky, at the birds, at the avenue, read everything that was brought to me by post, slept. Sometimes I went out of the house and wandered about till late in the evening. One day, as I was returning home, I accidentally strayed into a place I did not know. The sun was already sinking, and the shades of evening lay across the flowering rye. 2 rows of old, closely planted, very tall fir trees stood like 2 dense walls, forming a picturesque, gloomy avenue. I easily climbed over the fence and walked along the avenue, slipping over the fir needles which lay 2 inches deep on the ground. It was still and dark, and only here and there on the high treetops the vivid golden light quivered and made rainbows in the spiders' webs. There was a strong, almost stifling smell of resin. Then I turned into a long avenue of limes. Here, too, all was desolation and age. Last year's leaves rustled mournfully under my feet, and in the twilight shadows lurked between the trees. From the old orchard on the right came the faint, reluctant note of the golden oriole, who must have been old, too. But at last the limes ended. I walked by an old white house of 2 stories with a terrace, and there suddenly opened before me a view of a courtyard, a large pond with a bathing house, a group of green willows, and a village on the further bank with a high, narrow belfry on which there glittered a cross reflecting the setting sun. For a moment it breathed upon me the fascination of something near and very familiar, as though I had seen that landscape at some time in my childhood. At the white stone gates which led from the yard to the fields, old-fashioned solid gates with lions on them, were standing 2 girls. One of them, the elder, a slim, pale, very handsome girl with a perfect haystack of chestnut hair and a little obstinate mouth, had a severe expression and scarcely took notice of me. While the other, who was still very young, not more than 17 or 18, and was also slim and pale, with a large mouth and large eyes, looked at me with astonishment as I passed by, said something in English, and was overcome with embarrassment. And it seemed to me that these two charming faces, too, had long been familiar to me. And I returned home, feeling as though I had had a delightful dream. One morning, soon afterwards, as Bielokurov and I were walking near the house, a carriage drove unexpectedly into the yard, rustling over the grass, and in it was sitting one of those girls. It was the elder one. She had come to ask for subscriptions for some villagers whose cottages had been burnt down. Speaking with great earnestness and precision, and not looking at us, she told us how many houses in the village of Sianovo had been burnt, how many men, women, and children were left homeless, and what steps were proposed, to begin with, by the relief committee, of which she was now a member. After handing us the subscription list for our signatures, she put it away and immediately began to take leave of us. "You have quite forgotten us, Pyotr Petrovitch," she said to Bielokurov as she shook hands with him. "Do come, and if Monsieur N," she mentioned my name, "cares to make the acquaintance of admirers of his work and will come and see us, Mother and I will be delighted." I bowed. When she had gone, Pyotr Petrovitch began to tell me about her. The girl was, he said, of good family, and her name was Lydia Volchaninov, and the estate on which she lived with her mother and sister, like the village on the other side of the pond, was called Shelkovka. Her father had once held an important position in Moscow and had died with the rank of privy councillor. Although they had ample means, the Volchaninovs lived on their estate, summer and winter, without going away. Lydia was a teacher in the Zemstvo school in her own village, and received a salary of 25 rubles a month. She spent nothing on herself but her salary, and was proud of earning her own living. "An interesting family," said Bielokurov. "Let us go over one day. They will be delighted to see you." One afternoon on a holiday, we thought of the Volchaninovs and went to Shelkovka to see them. They, the mother and two daughters, were at home. The mother, Ekaterina Pavlovna, who at one time had been handsome, but now asthmatic, depressed, vague, and over-feeble for her years, tried to entertain me with conversation about painting. Having heard from her daughter that I might come to Shelkovka, she had hurriedly recalled 2 or 3 of my landscapes which she had seen in exhibitions in Moscow, and now asked what I meant to express by them. Lydia, or as they called her, Lida, talked more to Bielokurov than to me. Earnest and unsmiling, she asked him why he was not on the Zemstvo, and why he had not attended any of its meetings. "It's not right, Pyotr Petrovitch," she said reproachfully. "It's not right. It's too bad." "That's true, Lida, that's true," the mother assented. "It isn't right. Our whole district is in the hands of Balagin," Lida went on, addressing me. "He is the chairman of the Zemstvo board, and he has distributed all the posts in the district among his nephews and sons-in-law, and he does as he likes. He ought to be opposed. The young men ought to make a strong party, but you see what the young men among us are like. It's a shame, Pyotr Petrovitch." The younger sister, Genya, was silent while they were talking of the Zemstvo. She took no part in serious conversation. She was not looked upon as quite grown up by her family, and, like a child, was always called by the nickname of Missus because that was what she had called her English governess when she was a child. She was all the time looking at me with curiosity, and when I glanced at the photographs in the album, she explained to me, "That's Uncle. That's Godfather," moving her finger across the photograph. As she did so, she touched me with her shoulder like a child, and I had a close view of her delicate, undeveloped chest, her slender shoulders, her plait, and her thin little body tightly drawn in by her sash. We played croquet and lawn tennis. We walked about the garden, drank tea, and then sat a long time over supper. After the huge empty room with columns, I felt, as it were, at home in this small, snug house, where there were no oleographs on the walls and where the servants were spoken to with civility. And everything seemed to me young and pure, thanks to the presence of Lida and Misuch, and there was an atmosphere of refinement over everything. At supper, Lida talked to Bielokurov again of the Zemstvo, of Balagin, and of school libraries. She was an energetic, genuine girl with convictions, and it was interesting to listen to her. Though she talked a great deal, and in a loud voice, perhaps because she was accustomed to talking at school. On the other hand, Pyotr Petrovitch, who had retained from his student days the habit of turning every conversation into an argument, was tedious, flat, long-winded, and unmistakably anxious to appear clever and advanced. Gesticulating, he upset a sauce-boat with his sleeve, making a huge pool on the tablecloth, but no one except me appeared to notice it. It was dark and still as we went home. Good breeding is shown, not by not upsetting the sauce, but by not noticing it when somebody else does, said Bielokurov with a sigh. Yes, a splendid, intellectual family. I've dropped out of all decent society. It's dreadful how I've dropped out of it. It's all through work, work, work. He talked of how hard one had to work if one wanted to be a model farmer. And I thought what a heavy, sluggish fellow he was. Whenever he talked of anything serious, he articulated with intense effort, and worked just as he talked, slowly, always late and behindhand. I had little faith in his business capacity, if only from the fact that when I gave him letters to post, he carried them about in his pocket for weeks together. "The hardest thing of all," he muttered as he walked beside me, "the hardest thing of all is that, work as one may, one meets with no sympathy from anyone. No sympathy." I took to going to see the Volchaninovs. As a rule, I sat on the lower step of the terrace. I was fretted by dissatisfaction with myself. I was sorry at the thought of my life passing so rapidly and uninterestingly, and felt as though I would like to tear out of my breast the heart which had grown so heavy. And meanwhile, I heard talk on the terrace, the rustling of dresses, the pages of a book being turned. I soon grew accustomed to the idea that during the day, Lida received patients, gave out books, and often went into the village with a parasol and no hat. And in the evening, talked aloud of the Zemstvo and schools. This slim, handsome, invariably austere girl, with her small, well-cut mouth, always said dryly when the conversation turned on serious subjects, that's of no interest to you. She did not like me. She disliked me because I was a landscape painter and did not, in my pictures, portray the privations of the peasants, and because, as she fancied, I was indifferent to what she put such faith in. I remember when I was traveling on the banks of Lake Baikal, I met a Buryat girl on horseback, wearing a shirt and trousers of blue Chinese canvas. I asked her if she would sell me her pipe. While we talked, she looked contemptuously at my European face and hat, and in a moment she was bored with talking to me. She shouted to her horse and galloped on. And in just the same way, Lida despised me as an alien. She never outwardly expressed her dislike for me, but I felt it. And sitting on the lower step of the terrace, I felt irritated and said that doctoring peasants when one was not a doctor was deceiving them, and that it was easy to be benevolent when one had 6,000 acres. Meanwhile, her sister Masuse had no cares and spent her life in complete idleness, just as I did. When she got up in the morning, she immediately took up a book and sat down to read on the terrace in a deep armchair, with her feet hardly touching the ground, or hid herself with her book in the lime avenue, or walked out into the fields. She spent the whole day reading, poring greedily over her book. And only from the tired, dazed look in her eyes and the extreme paleness of her face, one could divine how this continual reading exhausted her brain. When I arrived, she would flush a little, leave her book, and looking into my face with her big eyes, would tell me eagerly of anything that had happened. For instance, that the chimney had been on fire in the servants' hall, or that one of the men had caught a huge fish in the pond. On ordinary days, she usually went about in a light blouse and a dark blue skirt. We went for walks together, picked cherries for making jam, went out in the boat. When she jumped up to reach a cherry or sculled in the boat, her thin, weak arms showed through her transparent sleeves. Or I painted a sketch, and she stood beside me watching rapturously. One Sunday at the end of July, I came to the Volchaninovs about 9 o'clock in the morning. I walked about the park, keeping a good distance from the house, looking for white mushrooms, of which there was a great number that summer, and noting their position so as to come and pick them afterwards with Genya. There was a warm breeze. I saw Genya and her mother, both in light holiday dresses, coming home from church, Genya holding her hat in the wind. Afterwards, I heard them having tea on the terrace. For a careless person like me, trying to find justification for my perpetual idleness, these holiday mornings in our country houses in the summer have always had a particular charm. When the green garden, still wet with dew, is all sparkling in the sun and looks radiant with happiness, when there is a scent of mignonette and oleander near the house, when the young people have just come back from church and are having breakfast in the garden, all so charmingly dressed and gay, and one knows that all these healthy, well-fed, handsome people are going to do nothing the whole long day, one wishes that all life were like that. Now, too, I had the same thought, and walked about the garden prepared to walk about like that, aimless and unoccupied, the whole day, the whole summer. Genya came out with a basket. She had a look in her face as though she knew she would find me in the garden, or had a presentiment of it. We gathered mushrooms and talked, and when she asked a question, she walked a little ahead so as to see my face. "A miracle happened in the village yesterday," she said. "The lame woman Pelagia has been ill the whole year. No doctors or medicines did her any good, but yesterday an old woman came and whispered something over her, and her illness passed away." "That's nothing much," I said. "You mustn't look for miracles only among sick people and old women. Isn't health a miracle? And life itself? Whatever is beyond understanding is a miracle." "And aren't you afraid of what is beyond understanding?" "No. Phenomena I don't understand I face boldly, and am not overwhelmed by them. I am above them. Man ought to recognize himself as superior to lions, tigers, stars, superior to everything in nature, even what seems miraculous and is beyond his understanding, or else he is not a man, but a mouse afraid of everything." Genya believed that as an artist I knew a very great deal and could guess correctly what I did not know. She longed for me to initiate her into the domain of the eternal and the beautiful, into that higher world in which, as she imagined, I was quite at home. And she talked to me of God, of the eternal life, of the miraculous. And I, who could never admit that myself and my imagination would be lost forever after death, answered, "Yes, men are immortal. Yes, there is eternal life in store for us." And she listened, believed, and did not ask for proofs. As we were going home, she stopped suddenly and said, "Our Lida is a remarkable person, isn't she? I love her very dearly, and would be ready to give my life for her any minute. But tell me," Genya touched my sleeve with her finger, "tell me, why do you always argue with her? Why are you irritated?" "Because she is wrong." Genya shook her head, and tears came into her eyes. "How incomprehensible that is," she said. At that minute, Lida had just returned from somewhere, and standing with a whip in her hand, a slim, beautiful figure in the sunlight at the steps, she was giving some orders to one of the men. Talking loudly, she hurriedly received 2 or 3 sick villagers. Then, with a busy and anxious face, she walked about the rooms, opening one cupboard after another, and went upstairs. It was a long time before they could find her and call her to dinner, and she came in when we had finished our soup. All these tiny details I remember with tenderness, and that whole day I remember vividly, though nothing special happened. After dinner, Genya lay in a long armchair reading, while I sat upon the bottom step of the terrace. We were silent. The whole sky was overcast with clouds, and it began to spot with fine rain. It was hot. The wind had dropped, and it seemed as though the day would never end. Ekaterina Pavlovna came out on the terrace, looking drowsy and carrying a fan. "Oh, Mother," said Genya, kissing her hand, "it's not good for you to sleep in the day." They adored each other. When one went into the garden, the other would stand on the terrace and, looking towards the trees, call, "Ow, Genya!" Or, "Mother, where are you?" They always said their prayers together and had the same faith, and they understood each other perfectly, even when they did not speak. And their attitude to people was the same. Ekaterina Pavlovna, too, grew quickly used to me and fond of me, and when I did not come for 2 or 3 days, sent to ask if I were well. She, too, gazed at my sketches with enthusiasm, and with the same openness and readiness to chatter as Missus, she told me what had happened, and confided to me her domestic secrets. She had a perfect reverence for her elder daughter. Lida did not care for endearments. She talked only of serious matters. She lived her life apart, and to her mother and sister was as sacred and enigmatic a person as the admiral, always sitting in his cabin, is to the sailors. "Our Lida is a remarkable person," the mother would often say. "Isn't she?" Now, too, while it was drizzling with rain, we talked of Lida. "She is a remarkable girl," said her mother, and added in an undertone, like a conspirator, looking about her timidly. "You wouldn't easily find another like her. Only, do you know, I am beginning to be a little uneasy. The school, the dispensary, books, all that's very good. But why go to extremes? She is 23, you know. It's time for her to think seriously of herself. With her books and her dispensary, she will find life has slipped by without having noticed it. She must be married." Genya, pale from reading, with her hair disarranged, raised her head and said, as it were, to herself, looking at her mother, "Mother, everything is in God's hands." And again she buried herself in her book. Byalokurov came in his tunic and embroidered shirt. We played croquet and tennis, then when it got dark, sat a long time over supper and talked again about schools, and that Balagan, who had the whole district under his thumb. As I went away from the Volchaninovs that evening, I carried away the impression of a long, long idle day, with a melancholy consciousness that everything ends in this world, however long it may be. Genya saw us out to the gate, and perhaps because she had been with me all day, from morning till night, I felt dull without her, and that all that charming family were near and dear to me. And for the first time that summer, I had a yearning to paint. "Tell me, why do you lead such a dreary, colorless life?" I asked Bielokurov as I went home. "My life is dreary, difficult, and monotonous, because I am an artist, a strange person. From my earliest days, I've been wrung by envy, self-dissatisfaction, distrust in my work. I'm always poor. I'm a wanderer. But you're a healthy, normal man, a landowner and a gentleman. Why do you live in such an uninteresting way? Why do you get so little out of life? Why haven't you, for instance, fallen in love with Lida or Genya?" "You forget that I love another woman," answered Bielokurov. He was referring to Lubov Ivanovna, the lady who shared the lodge with him. Every day I saw this lady, very plump, rotund, and dignified, not unlike a fat goose, walking about the garden in the Russian national dress and beads, always carrying a parasol. And the servant was continually calling her in to dinner or to tea. 3 years before, she had taken one of the lodges for a summer holiday and had settled down at Bielokurov's apparently forever. She was 10 years older than he was and kept a sharp hand over him, so much so that he had to ask her permission when he went out of the house. She often sobbed in a deep, masculine note, and then I used to send word to her that if she did not leave off, I should give up my rooms there, and she left off. When we got home, Bielokurov sat down on the sofa and frowned thoughtfully, and I began walking up and down the room, conscious of a soft emotion, as though I were in love. I wanted to talk about the Volchaninovs. Lida could only fall in love with a member of the Zemstvo, as devoted to schools and hospitals as she is, I said. Oh, for the sake of a girl like that one might not only go into the Zemstvo, but even wear out iron shoes, like the girl in the fairy tale. And Misutz? What a sweet creature she is, that Misutz. Bielokurov, drawling out, began a long-winded disquisition on the malady of the age, pessimism. He talked confidently, in a tone that suggested that I was opposing him. Hundreds of miles of desolate, monotonous, burnt-up steppe cannot induce such deep depression as one man when he sits and talks, and one does not know when he will go. It's not a question of pessimism or optimism, I said irritably. It's simply that 99 people out of 100 have no sense. Bielokurov took this as aimed at himself, was offended, and went away. 3. The prince is staying at Milozyomovo, and he asks to be remembered to you, said Lida to her mother. She had just come in and was taking off her gloves. He gave me a great deal of interesting news. He promised to raise the question of a medical relief center at Milozyomovo again at the provincial assembly, but he says there is very little hope of it. And turning to me, she said, "Excuse me, I always forget that this cannot be interesting to you." I felt irritated. "Why not interesting to me?" I said, shrugging my shoulders. "You do not care to know my opinion, but I assure you the question has great interest for me." Yes? Yes. In my opinion, a medical relief center at Milozyomovo is quite unnecessary. My irritation infected her. She looked at me, screwing up her eyes, and asked, "What is necessary? Landscapes?" Landscapes are not, either. Nothing is. She finished taking off her gloves and opened the newspaper, which had just been brought from the post. A minute later, she said quietly, evidently restraining herself, "Last week, Anna died in childbirth, and if there had been a medical relief center near, she would have lived. And I think even landscape painters ought to have some opinions on the subject." "I have a very definite opinion on that subject, I assure you," I answered, and she screened herself with the newspaper, as though unwilling to listen to me. To my mind, all these schools, dispensaries, libraries, medical relief centers, under present conditions, only serve to aggravate the bondage of the people. The peasants are fettered by a great chain, and you do not break the chain, but only add fresh links to it. That's my view of it. She raised her eyes to me and smiled ironically, and I went on trying to formulate my leading idea. What matters is not that Anna died in childbirth, but that all these Annas, Mavras, Pelagayas, toil from early morning till dark, fall ill from working beyond their strength, all their lives tremble for their sick and hungry children, all their lives are being doctored, and in dread of death, and in disease, fade, and grow old early, and die in filth and stench. Their children begin the same story over again as soon as they grow up, and so it goes on for hundreds of years, and milliards of men live worse than beasts, in continual terror. For a mere crust of bread. The whole horror of their position lies in their never having time to think of their souls, of their image and semblance. Cold, hunger, animal terror, a burden of toil. Like avalanches of snow, block for them every way to spiritual activity. That is, to what distinguishes man from the brutes, And what is the only thing which makes life worth living? You go to their help with hospitals and schools, but you don't free them from their fetters by that. On the contrary, you bind them in closer bonds, as by introducing new prejudices, you increase the number of their wants, to say nothing of the fact that they've got to pay the Zemstvo for drugs and books. And so toil harder than ever. I am not going to argue with you, said Lida, putting down the paper. I've heard all that before. I will only say one thing. One cannot sit with one's hands in one's lap. It's true that we are not saving humanity, and perhaps we make a great many mistakes, but we do what we can, and we are right. The highest and holiest task for a civilized being is to serve his neighbors, and we try to serve them as best we can. You don't like it, but one can't please everyone. That's true, Lida, said her mother. That's true. In Lida's presence, she was always a little timid and looked at her nervously as she talked, afraid of saying something superfluous or inopportune. And she never contradicted her, but always assented. That's true, Lida. That's true. Teaching the peasants to read and write, books of wretched precepts and rhymes, and medical relief centers cannot diminish either ignorance or the death rate, just as the light from your windows cannot light up this huge garden. Said I, you give nothing. By meddling in these people's lives, you only create new wants in them and new demands on their labor. Ah, good heavens, but one must do something, said Lida with vexation, and from her tone one could see that she thought my arguments worthless and despised them. The people must be freed from hard physical labor, said I. We must lighten their yoke, let them have time to breathe, that they may not spend all their lives at the stove, at the wash-tub, and in the fields, but may also have time to think of their souls, of God, may have time to develop their spiritual capacities. The highest vocation of man is spiritual. Activity, the perpetual search for truth and the meaning of life. Make coarse animal labor unnecessary for them. Let them feel themselves free. And then you will see what a mockery these dispensaries and books are. Once a man recognizes his true vocation, he can only be satisfied by religion, science, and art, and not by these trifles. Free them from labor? Laughed Lida. But is that possible? Yes. Take upon yourself a share of their labor. If all of us, townspeople and country people, all without exception, would agree to divide between us the labor which mankind spends on the satisfaction of their physical needs, each of us would perhaps need to work only for 2 or 3 hours a day. Imagine that we all, rich and poor, work only for 3 hours a day, and the rest of our time is free. Imagine further that in order to depend even less upon our bodies and to labor less, we invent machines to replace our work. We try to cut down our needs to the minimum. We would harden ourselves and our children that they should not be afraid of hunger and cold, and that we shouldn't be continually trembling for their health like Anna, Mavra, and Pelagia. Imagine that we don't keep dispensaries, tobacco factories, or distilleries. What a lot of free time would be left us after all. All of us together would devote our leisure to science and art. Just as the peasants sometimes work, the whole community together mending the roads. So all of us, as a community, would search for truth and the meaning of life, and I am convinced that the truth would be discovered very quickly. Man would escape from this continual, agonizing, oppressive dread of death, and even from death itself. "You contradict yourself, though," said Lida. "You talk about science, and are yourself opposed to elementary education." Elementary education, when a man has nothing to read but the signs on public houses, and sometimes books which he cannot understand, such education has existed among us since the time of Rurik. Gogol's Petrushka has been reading for ever so long, yet as the village was in the days of Rurik, so it has remained. What is needed is not elementary education, but freedom for a wide development of spiritual capacities. What are wanted are not schools, but universities. You are opposed to medicine, too. Yes, it would be necessary only for the study of diseases as natural phenomena, and not for the cure of them. If one must cure, it should not be diseases, but the causes of them. Remove the principal cause, physical labor, and then there will be no disease. I don't believe in a science that cures disease, I went on excitedly. When science and art are real, they aim not at temporary private ends, but at eternal and universal. They seek for truth and the meaning of life. They seek for God, for the soul. And when they are tied down to the needs and evils of the day, to dispensaries and libraries, they only complicate and hamper life. We have plenty of doctors, chemists, lawyers, plenty of people can read and write, but we are quite without biologists, mathematicians, philosophers, poets. The whole of our intelligence, the whole of our spiritual energy is spent on satisfying temporary, passing needs. Scientific men, writers, artists are hard at work. Thanks to them, the conveniences of life are multiplied from day to day. Our physical demands increase, yet truth is still a long way off, and man still remains the most rapacious and dirty animal. Everything is tending to the degeneration of the majority of mankind, and the loss forever of all fitness for life. In such conditions, an artist's work has no meaning. And the more talented he is, the stranger and the more unintelligible is his position, as when one looks into it, it is evident that he is working for the amusement of a rapacious and unclean animal, and is supporting the existing order. And I don't care to work, and I won't work. Nothing is any use. Let the earth sink to perdition. "Missus, go out of the room," said Lida to her sister, apparently thinking my words pernicious to the young girl. Genya looked mournfully at her mother and sister, and went out of the room. These are the charming things people say when they want to justify their indifference, said Lida. It is easier to disapprove of schools and hospitals than to teach or heal. That's true, Lida, that's true, the mother assented. You threaten to give up working, said Lida. You evidently set a high value on your work. Let us give up arguing. We shall never agree, since I put the most imperfect dispensary or library of which you have just spoken so contemptuously on a higher level than any landscape. And turning at once to her mother, she began speaking in quite a different tone. The prince is very much changed, and much thinner than when he was with us last. He is being sent to Vichy. She told her mother about the prince in order to avoid talking to me. Her face glowed, and to hide her feeling she bent low over the table, as though she were short-sighted, and made a show of reading the newspaper. My presence was disagreeable to her. I said goodbye and went home. 4. It was quite still out of doors. The village on the further side of the pond was already asleep. There was not a light to be seen, and only the stars were faintly reflected in the pond. At the gate with the lions on it, Genya was standing motionless, waiting to escort me. "Everyone is asleep in the village," I said to her, trying to make out her face in the darkness, and I saw her mournful dark eyes fixed upon me. "The publican and the horse stealers are asleep, while we, well-bred people, argue and irritate each other." It was a melancholy August night. Melancholy because there was already a feeling of autumn. The moon was rising behind a purple cloud, and it shed a faint light upon the road and on the dark fields of winter corn by the sides. From time to time, a star fell. Genya walked beside me along the road and tried not to look at the sky, that she might not see the falling stars, which for some reason frightened her. "I believe you are right," she said, shivering with the damp night air. "If people altogether could devote themselves to spiritual ends, they would soon know everything. Of course, we are higher beings, and if we were really to recognize the whole force of human genius and lived only for higher ends, we should in the end become like gods. But that will never be. Mankind will degenerate till no traces of genius remain." When the gates were out of sight, Genya stopped and shook hands with me. "Good night," she said, shivering. She had nothing but her blouse over her shoulders and was shrinking with cold. "Come tomorrow." I felt wretched at the thought of being left alone, irritated and dissatisfied with myself and other people, and I, too, tried not to look at the falling stars. "Stay another minute," I said to her. "I entreat you." I loved Genya. I must have loved her because she met me when I came and saw me off when I went away, because she looked at me tenderly and enthusiastically. How touchingly beautiful were her pale face, slender neck, slender arms, her weakness, her idleness, her reading. And intelligence? I suspected in her intelligence above the average. I was fascinated by the breadth of her views, perhaps because they were different from those of the stern, handsome Lida, who disliked me. Genya liked me because I was an artist. I had conquered her heart by my talent and had a passionate desire to paint for her sake alone. And I dreamed of her as of my little queen, who with me would possess those trees, those fields, the mists, the dawn. The exquisite and beautiful scenery in the midst of which I had felt myself hopelessly solitary and useless. "Stay another minute," I begged her. "I beseech you." I took off my overcoat and put it over her chilly shoulders. Afraid of looking ugly and absurd in a man's overcoat, she laughed, threw it off, and at that instant I put my arms round her and covered her face, shoulders, and hands with kisses. "Till tomorrow," she whispered, and softly, as though afraid of breaking upon the silence of the night, she embraced me. "We have no secrets from one another. I must tell my mother and my sister at once. It's so dreadful. Mother is all right. Mother likes you. But Lida?" She ran to the gates. "Goodbye," she called. And then for 2 minutes I heard her running. I did not want to go home, and I had nothing to go for. I stood still for a little time, hesitating, and made my way slowly back to look once more at the house in which she lived, the sweet, simple old house, which seemed to be watching me from the windows of its upper story. And understanding all about it, I walked by the terrace, sat on the seat by the tennis ground, in the dark under the old elm tree, and looked from there at the house. In the windows of the top story, where Misu slept, there appeared a bright light, which changed to a soft green. They had covered the lamp with the shade. Shadows began to move. I was full of tenderness, peace, and satisfaction with myself, satisfaction at having been able to be carried away by my feelings and having fallen in love. And at the same time, I felt uncomfortable at the thought that only a few steps away from me, in one of the rooms of that house, there was Lida, who disliked and perhaps hated me. I went on sitting there, wondering whether Genya would come out. I listened and fancied I heard voices talking upstairs. About an hour passed. The green light went out, and the shadows were no longer visible. The moon was standing high above the house and lighting up the sleeping garden and the paths. The dahlias and the roses in front of the house could be seen distinctly and looked all the same color. It began to grow very cold. I went out of the garden, picked up my coat on the road, and slowly sauntered home. When next day after dinner I went to the Volchaninovs, the glass door into the garden was wide open. I sat down on the terrace, expecting Genya every minute to appear from behind the flower beds on the lawn, or from one of the avenues, or that I should hear her voice from the house. Then I walked into the drawing room, the dining room. There was not a soul to be seen. From the dining room, I walked along the long corridor to the hall and back. In this corridor, there were several doors, and through one of them I heard the voice of Lida. God sent a crow, she said, in a loud, emphatic voice, probably dictating. God sent a crow a piece of cheese. A crow, a piece of cheese. Who's there? She called suddenly, hearing my steps. It's I. Ah, excuse me, I cannot come out to you this minute. I'm giving Dasha her lesson. Is Ekaterina Pavlovna in the garden? No, she went away with my sister this morning to our aunt in the province of Penza, and in the winter they will probably go abroad, she added after a pause. God sent the crow a piece of cheese. Have you written it? I went into the hall and stared vacantly at the pond and the village, and the sound reached me of a piece of cheese. God sent the crow a piece of cheese. And I went back by the way I had come here for the first time, first from the yard into the garden past the house, then into the avenue of lime trees. At this point I was overtaken by a small boy who gave me a note. I told my sister everything, and she insists on my parting from you, I read. I could not wound her by disobeying. God will give you happiness. Forgive me. If only you knew how bitterly my mother and I are crying. Then there was the dark fir avenue, the broken-down fence. On the field, where then the rye was in flower and the corncrakes were calling, now there were cows and hobbled horses. On the slope, there were bright green patches of winter corn. A sober workaday feeling came over me, and I felt ashamed of all I had said at the Volchaninovs, and felt bored with life, as I had been before. When I got home, I packed and set off that evening for Petersburg. I never saw the Volchaninovs again. Not long ago, on my way to the Crimea, I met Byelokurov in the train. As before, he was wearing a jerkin and an embroidered shirt, and when I asked how he was, he replied that, God be praised, he was well. We began talking. He had sold his old estate and bought another, smaller one, in the name of Lyubov Ivanovna. He could tell me little about the Volchanovs. Lida, he said, was still living in Shelkovka and teaching in the school. She had, by degrees, succeeded in gathering round her a circle of people sympathetic to her, who made a strong party. And at the last election had turned out Balagin, who had till then had the whole district under his thumb. About Genya, he only told me that she did not live at home, and that he did not know where she was. I am beginning to forget the old house, and only sometimes, when I am painting or reading, I suddenly, apropos of nothing, remember the green light in the window, the sound of my footsteps as I walked home through the fields in the night. With my heart full of love, rubbing my hands in the cold. And still more rarely, at moments when I am sad and depressed by loneliness, I have dim memories, and little by little I begin to feel that she is thinking of me too, that she is waiting for me, and that we shall meet. Misus, where are you? Now let us explore the work in greater depth. Anton Chekhov's profound narrative craftsmanship in An Artist's Story reveals a complex intersection between impressionistic artistic techniques and the broader intellectual climate of the fin de siècle. Prompting deeper scholarly inquiries into the relationship between literature and late 19th century scientific and psychological advancements. By centering the story around an unnamed impressionist painter who serves as both protagonist and narrator, Chekhov deliberately engages with the cultural and psychological profile of contemporary artists while simultaneously maintaining his own unique philosophical and writerly perspective as a physician. The structural composition, narrative chronotope, and literary psychologism embedded within the text reflect expressive methods that parallel impressionist aesthetics, drawing from shared cultural sources, such as the rapid march of scientific progress, emerging medical discoveries, and early experimental studies of memory and color vision. Rather than adopting Impressionism uncritically, Chekhov investigates these modern modes of perception and representation, filtering them through a rationalized worldview that balances artistic impression with intellectual reflection. The interplay between the painter's subjective visual experiences and the rigorous social realities depicted in the narrative demonstrates how Chekhov utilized impressionistic forms, not merely as stylistic decoration, but as an object of literary exploration. Through this critical lens, the story emerges as a rich synthesis of aesthetic inquiry and psychological depth, capturing the tensions of an era captivated by shifting paradigms of human consciousness, memory, and sensory perception. Art and action in Chekhov's The House with the Mezzanine. This video is relevant because it discusses the thematic tensions, character dynamics, and artistic dilemmas central to Anton Chekhov's The House with the Mezzanine. Anton Chekhov's An Artist's Story begins with a man who has almost ceased to participate in his own existence. The unnamed narrator is a landscape painter, but when the story opens, he is neither painting nor pursuing any urgent purpose. He resides in the abandoned manor house of Bielikurov's estate, surrounded by columns, empty rooms, rattling stoves, and windows that blaze frighteningly during thunderstorms. His environment is both spacious and barren, grand in its architectural remains, but emptied of the life that might have given such grandeur meaning. The house is therefore more than a background. It externalizes the narrator's condition. He possesses imagination, education, mobility, and artistic ability, yet his days are vacant. He reads whatever arrives by post, sleeps, watches birds and clouds, and wanders without destination. His claim that destiny has condemned him to idleness is immediately questionable, because the passivity described as fate is also a pattern he continually chooses. The story's decisive movement begins when that aimless wandering leads him beyond familiar boundaries. He enters an avenue of ancient firs, followed by another of limes, and arrives at the Volchaninov estate as if passing through several layers of memory. The landscape appears simultaneously strange and remembered. The fir avenue is gloomy, resinous, and enclosed, while the limes, old orchard, white house, pond, willows, village, and distant belfry form an image of cultivated harmony. The narrator feels that he has seen the scene in childhood, although he cannot identify an actual memory. Chekhov makes this recognition emotional rather than factual. Shelkovka resembles an inner homeland, a place where beauty promises intimacy and where the narrator might recover a forgotten relation to life. The two sisters standing at the gate strengthen the dreamlike impression. Their faces seem familiar before he knows their names, as though they have emerged from a picture already present in his imagination. Yet the sisters do not merely represent two versions of feminine beauty. They embody competing relationships to reality. Lida is disciplined, forceful, socially active, and committed to practical service. She teaches in the Zemstvo school, distributes books, receives sick villagers, raises money for fire victims, and campaigns against Balagin's corrupt control of district institutions. Her identity rests on useful action. Genya, called Misuchi, lives within a quieter realm of reading, trust, religious wonder, domestic affection, and emotional receptivity. She spends her days much as the narrator does, without organized labor, but her idleness is not burdened by his corrosive self-consciousness. She reads intensely, listens, observes, believes, and longs for access to the eternal and beautiful. Lydia asks what must be done for people now. Genya asks what existence means beyond what can be seen and understood. The narrator is drawn toward Genya because she receives him as an artist, and because her questions allow him to imagine that his neglected vocation still grants him spiritual authority. The contrast between the sisters also reveals a division within the narrator himself. He admires Lydia's energy, even while resenting her judgments. Her purposeful life exposes the weakness of his own. She does not regard artistic status as sufficient evidence of moral worth, and she refuses to flatter him merely because his paintings have been exhibited. Her repeated declaration that serious public questions are of no interest to him wounds his vanity, because it is partly true. He has not entered the district's public life, relieved suffering, cultivated his craft, or even governed his days. When he mocks dispensaries, schools, and libraries, he develops a philosophical case against incomplete reforms. But the force of his argument cannot erase the convenience with which it excuses him from action. Lydia's contempt matters to him precisely because she recognizes the gap between the grandeur of his ideas and the emptiness of his conduct. Chekhov does not, however, reduce their conflict to a simple contest between a virtuous reformer and a selfish aesthete. Lydia's practical idealism has its own limitations. Her speech is loud, habitual, and sometimes authoritarian. She is so accustomed to directing pupils, servants, patients, and political allies that she also directs the moral atmosphere of her household. Her devotion to service leaves little room for forms of experience she cannot organize. Art interests her mainly in relation to social need, and because the narrator paints landscapes rather than peasant misery, she treats his work as decorative indulgence. Her seriousness becomes a form of exclusion. She decides which topics matter, which activities possess value, and which influences are suitable for Genya. Her care for others is genuine, but it coexists with a confidence that permits her to govern the emotional lives of those nearest to her. The narrator's critique of reform arises during the story's central argument over a proposed medical relief center. Lydia invokes the death of Anna in childbirth as evidence that immediate institutions save real lives. The narrator responds by widening the frame until the individual tragedy nearly disappears. He argues that hospitals, schools, and libraries add links to the chain binding the peasantry because they treat symptoms while leaving exhausting labor untouched. The peasants remain hungry, overworked, frightened for their children, and deprived of time for spiritual development. According to him, the true solution would be the universal sharing of necessary labor, the reduction of material wants, and the use of machinery to free human beings for religion, science, philosophy, and art. He imagines a society in which everyone works only a few hours a day and devotes the remaining time to the collective search for truth and immortality. There is moral seriousness in this vision. The narrator understands that suffering is structural rather than accidental, and he refuses to mistake charitable relief for liberation. His complaint that peasants lack time to think about their souls challenges the paternalism of reformers who decide that literacy and medicine are enough, while leaving the economic order intact. He also perceives how technological progress can multiply desires without making humanity wiser. Doctors, lawyers, chemists, and literate officials may proliferate, while cruelty, exploitation, and fear remain. His defense of spiritual freedom is not merely selfish rhetoric. It expresses Chekhov's recurring concern that human beings require more than bodily survival and administrative improvement. Nevertheless, the narrator's position collapses when tested against the urgency of particular suffering. Anna has already died. Pelagia, is ill. Villagers have lost their cottages. A future society liberated from labor cannot help them tonight. Lydia's imperfect dispensary may not abolish oppression, but it can prevent a death that metaphysical argument cannot reverse. The narrator's universalism allows him to dismiss local action because it is incomplete. And his ideal of total transformation becomes a reason for doing nothing until everything can be changed at once. His final declaration that he will not work and that the earth may perish exposes the nihilistic underside of his idealism. He demands absolute meaning from art and science, then abandons them when they cannot immediately discover the truth of existence. Lydia's reply identifies this danger with painful accuracy. It is easier to condemn schools and hospitals than to teach or heal. Yet her answer also narrows the question. She treats his vision as nothing but a disguise for indifference, overlooking the legitimate distinction between alleviating suffering and ending the conditions that reproduce it. Chekhov allows both speakers to reveal truths while also revealing themselves. Lydia is right about the ethical necessity of action. The narrator is right that reform can become an endless management of misery. Lydia's practical work risks accepting the structure she opposes. The narrator's radical critique risks leaving every victim unaided. Their conversation fails, not because one possesses truth and the other error, but because each turns a partial truth into an absolute moral identity. Bielokurov provides a comic and sobering third response to the problem of meaningful action. He continually speaks of work, responsibility, sympathy, and enlightened attitudes, yet he is slow, ineffectual, and governed by habit. His letters remain unposted in his pockets. His agricultural seriousness is largely verbal. Even his relationship with Lyubov Ivanovna has become a form of passive submission. He complains that no one sympathizes with him, but he seems unwilling to undertake the inner change that might make a different life possible. The spilled sauce at the Volchaninov supper condenses his character into one gesture. He causes disorder through clumsiness and then converts the incident into a polished observation about good breeding. He is always ready with a formulation after the event, but rarely with effective action before it. The narrator despises Bielokurov because he recognizes an exaggerated version of his own inertia. Both men possess enough privilege to choose their lives, and both narrate their passivity as though it had been imposed upon them. The difference is aesthetic consciousness. The narrator can perceive his stagnation, suffer from it, and transform it into eloquent reflection. He feels envy, dissatisfaction, poverty, loneliness, and distrust of his art. Bielokurov merely repeats his complaints. Yet eloquence does not necessarily make the narrator freer. His heightened perception may even deepen his paralysis, since every activity appears compromised when measured against his longing for absolute truth. Genya offers him an escape from this self-enclosed condition, but his love is inseparable from projection. He cherishes her delicacy, pallor, slenderness, curiosity, and faith in him. She believes that an artist has entered the eternal realm and can interpret what ordinary understanding cannot reach. Rather than correcting this idealization, he accepts it. When she asks about immortality, he assures her that eternal life awaits humanity, not because he possesses knowledge, but because he cannot tolerate the extinction of himself and his imagination. He speaks as an authority in order to preserve both her faith and his desired image of himself. Their intimacy is therefore tender, but unequal. Genya sees the artist he might be. He sees the devoted companion who might restore his desire to paint. The beauty of their relationship lies in the ordinary hours surrounding it. They gather mushrooms, pick cherries, row on the pond, walk through fields, and stand together before unfinished sketches. Chekhov does not construct their attachment through dramatic declarations until very late. It grows through repeated arrivals and departures, through Genya's slight blush when the narrator appears, through her eagerness to report minor household events, and through her habit of seeing him to the gate. The apparent insignificance of these moments is precisely their meaning. Against the narrator's demand for eternal and universal purposes, love develops through small, temporary, local gestures. The story quietly suggests that a life may become meaningful, not when it escapes the passing world, but when it attends fully to what is passing. The summer setting intensifies this theme. The narrator repeatedly experiences long, idle days that seem capable of lasting forever, even as he knows that everything ends. Dew, church mornings, holiday clothes, gardens, mushrooms, fine rain, games, tea, and supper create an atmosphere of suspended time. Such days appear outside history, sheltered from labor and conflict. Yet the signs of ending are present from the beginning: old trees, fallen leaves, fading light, a reluctant oriole, approaching autumn. The narrator's happiness is already becoming memory while he lives it. Chekhov's landscapes are therefore not decorative pauses. They register time more precisely than the characters' arguments do. Summer moves toward autumn. Light changes. Cultivated fields replace flowering rye. The green lamp is extinguished. Human beings speak as if they can define life through principles, while the natural world reveals life as transition. Ekaterina Pavlovna deepens the story's domestic tenderness. Asthmatic, vague, affectionate, and somewhat fearful, she reveres Lydia while sharing an almost wordless emotional bond with Genya. Her repeated agreement, "That's true, Lida, that's true," is both comic and sad. It expresses love, timidity, dependence, and a household hierarchy that Lydia may not consciously recognize. The mother admires her elder daughter's service, but privately worries that work will consume her youth. She hopes Lydia will marry, not simply from convention, but because she senses that purposeful activity can become another means of evading personal life. Lydia accuses the narrator of indifference, yet she may also protect herself from vulnerability through duty. The narrator's declaration of love occurs after his ideological defeat. He has argued magnificently and behaved badly. Genya nevertheless accompanies him into the August night and says she believes he is right. Her agreement comforts him, But the deeper transformation comes through physical presence: the damp road, the rising moon, the cold air, the falling stars, her hand on his sleeve.
When he asks her to remain, his abstract discontent becomes a specific desire.
He no longer speaks of humanity, genius, or universal truth, but of one person leaving him alone. The kiss is spontaneous and almost awkward. Genya laughs at the overcoat, throws it off, embraces him, and immediately thinks of telling her mother and sister because the household recognizes no secrets. Her innocence is not mere childishness. It is an ethical openness opposed to the concealment and self-dramatization of the adults around her. Let us now examine the work through its primary analytical perspective. Chekhov's An Artist's Story turns a summer of visits, arguments, and frustrated love into a meditation on how people justify the lives they fail to live. The narrator begins by calling himself condemned by destiny to perpetual idleness. Yet no external force prevents him from working, loving, choosing, or serving. His destiny is partly a defense against responsibility. By naming passivity as fate, he disguises repeated refusal as a metaphysical condition. Chekhov therefore presents freedom not as heroic independence, but as the burden of admitting that inaction is also a choice. The narrator's solitude is both real suffering and a self-made enclosure. He inhabits an immense, nearly empty house whose droning stoves and shaking walls externalize his unstable inner life. He watches the world rather than entering it, and his landscape painting repeats this distance. Nature becomes an object of contemplation, while human need remains outside the frame. Lida senses this moral separation and despises what she sees as aesthetic indifference. Yet he is not merely selfish. He feels time passing, distrusts his work, envies others, and longs for a life in which beauty, thought, and intimacy might be reconciled. His tragedy is that he can imagine wholeness more readily than he can practice it. Shilkovka briefly interrupts this paralysis. Reached through dark avenues and twilight, the estate seems remembered from childhood, as though it offers a home preceding choice, a place where belonging is given rather than earned. The Volchaninov household contains civility, affection, ritual, meaningful activity, and aesthetic harmony. Yet the narrator enters as a spectator, turning people and places into impressions. His habit of aestheticizing life later weakens his ability to defend love in practical terms. The conflict with Lida dramatizes competing theories of responsibility. Lida accepts the imperfect world as the field in which duty must operate. Schools, libraries, dispensaries, relief committees, and political opposition may be inadequate, but inadequacy does not cancel obligation. She measures seriousness by service rendered to particular people now. The narrator judges action from the standpoint of ultimate liberation. Minor reforms, he argues, add links to bondage. Physical labor must be shared and reduced so that humanity can devote itself to truth, religion, science, and art. His challenge is genuine. Charity may preserve the system that produces suffering, and institutions may treat symptoms while leaving causes untouched. Chekhov refuses to make either position wholly correct. Lida's practical morality risks coercion and pride. She assumes authority over villagers, mother, sister, and household, and can treat opposition as moral delinquency. The narrator's universalism, however, is compromised by privilege. He demands freedom from degrading labor, while already free from it, and he refuses even the artistic work he calls humanity's highest vocation. By insisting that nothing short of total transformation matters, he permits himself to do nothing until impossible conditions arrive. Anna's death in childbirth gives the debate its sharpest ethical force. Lida invokes one preventable death. The narrator replies with generations of Annas, Mavras, and Pelagias crushed by toil. He expands the frame from individual tragedy to historical structure, but risks erasing the person who might have been saved. The episode asks whether responsibility begins with the sufferer before us or with the system determining many lives. Immediate care without structural thought may reproduce bondage, but structural thought without immediate care becomes cruelty disguised as depth. Dignity requires attention to both the singular victim and the conditions that make suffering ordinary. Death also haunts the narrator's philosophy personally. He tells Genya that life and health are miracles and that humanity should not fear what it cannot understand. Yet, when she asks about immortality, he promises eternal life because he cannot accept the extinction of himself and his imagination. His confidence is emotionally motivated rather than demonstrated. This does not merely expose hypocrisy, it reveals how metaphysical belief may grow from love of consciousness and terror of loss. Genya believes because she trusts him, while he answers because he wants the universe to preserve what he values. Genya represents another relation to freedom. She is idle like the narrator, but her idleness is receptive. She reads, wonders, believes, and remains open to beauty. Still, she is not autonomous. Her family treats her as a child, and her devotion to Lida is so complete that she surrenders her happiness rather than wound her sister. Her final decision can be read as loyalty, weakness, obedience, or internalized domination. Everything is in God's hands, she says, a formula that comforts but also transfers agency away from the self. In the decisive moment, fate, God, duty, and fear converge, but behind them stands a choice she cannot bear to claim. Love awakens the narrator to possibility. For the first time that summer, he wants to paint. He imagines sharing fields, mists, dawns, and creation with Genya. Beauty becomes relational rather than solitary. Yet his language remains revealing. He dreams of her as his little queen, loves her admiration, and values her partly because she confirms his identity as an artist initiated into the eternal and the beautiful. His affection is sincere, but it is entangled with the desire to be believed. The night of confession presents freedom as a fleeting opening. Falling stars frighten Genya. Autumn approaches, and cold enters the scene as love is declared. Happiness appears briefly and demands courage before circumstances close around it. After Genya runs home, the narrator waits beneath the green light. He senses Lida's hostility, but does not knock, appeal to the mother, or assert the seriousness of his intention. The next day, he accepts Genya's note as final. His conduct reveals the meaning of his fatalism. He experiences other people's decisions as destiny because he repeatedly abandons his own power to answer them. Lida's intervention raises the question of whether responsibility can become domination. She may sincerely believe she is protecting Genya from an idle, unstable man whose ideas she considers harmful. Her judgment is not groundless. Yet she decides Genya's future without granting her equal adulthood. Moral certainty becomes power over another consciousness. Chekhov thus distinguishes care for others from ownership of their choices. Dignity requires being treated not merely as someone to protect or improve, but as a person capable of risking error. The narrator's departure for Petersburg is another refusal disguised as necessity. Shame could summon him to change, but instead he leaves. Later, Lida succeeds politically, while his life remains suspended in memory. Her victory over Balagin confirms that limited action can alter reality even when it cannot redeem the human condition. Byelokurov remains trapped in comic surrender, selling his estate and buying another in Lyubov Ivanovna's name. Lida acts and risks hardness. Genya obeys and disappears. Byelokurov complains and submits. The narrator dreams, argues, and retreats. The ending makes memory both consolation and judgment. The narrator forgets much, yet the green lamp, cold hands, footsteps, and a heart full of love return involuntarily. Memory preserves the dignity of what was possible, but also reveals the cost of not choosing. His fantasy that Genya still thinks of him resembles his earlier faith in immortality. Imagination protects him from finality. He converts loss into deferred reunion because he cannot accept that a consciousness, a love, or a possible life may vanish. Misus, where are you? Addresses Genya, but also the lost self who briefly believed he could belong to the world. Chekhov offers no final doctrine. Ideals can guide or excuse. Service can preserve dignity or become domination. Solitude can nurture vision or decay into sterility. Faith can resist death or conceal fear. Fate is rarely external. It is made from temperament, privilege, custom, hesitation, authority, and the stories people tell about helplessness. Freedom appears in small, perishable moments when one must act without certainty. The narrator fails not because he lacks insight, but because he uses insight as a substitute for commitment. His grief retains dignity, yet it also proves that a more courageous life was possible. A second perspective reveals further dimensions of the work. From the perspective of folklore studies, an artist's story is saturated with inherited beliefs, oral formulas, ritual gestures, and folk motifs. Chekhov places modern debates about medicine, education, art, and reform within a rural world where older forms of meaning still organize perception. Folklore survives not as decoration, but in landscape symbolism, healing traditions, religious observance, household speech, and expectations about fate. The narrator's journey to Shelkovka resembles passage into a folktale threshold. He strays from a known road, crosses a fence, passes through dark fir and lime avenues, and emerges before an old house, pond, village, belfry, and shining cross. The lion gates guard this border. His feeling that he has seen the place and the sisters before gives the encounter the quality of ancestral memory or enchanted repetition. He enters as though stepping into a story already circulating before him. The sisters evoke contrasting folkloric types without becoming fixed allegories. Lida resembles the stern elder sister, keeper of order and law, while Genya appears as the younger maiden, associated with wonder and vulnerability. Chekhov complicates the pattern. The elder is a teacher and reformer rather than a villain, while the younger is not rescued through marriage. The familiar promise of romantic completion is invoked only to be broken. Oral tradition is explicit in the story of Pelageia, the lame woman cured after an old woman whispers over her. The whispered charm belongs to vernacular healing, where secret words, breath, gesture, and the authority of an experienced woman are believed to restore health. Genya calls it a miracle. The narrator expands the miraculous to include health and life. Chekhov neither verifies nor mocks the cure. What matters is that the village possesses a healing narrative independent of official medicine. Religious custom structures the Volchaninov household. Genya and her mother return from church in holiday dresses, pray together, share faith, and interpret uncertainty through the formula that everything is in God's hands. Sunday rest, breakfast, proper clothing, and prayer bind domestic life to the sacred calendar. Their calls across the garden, "Ahoo, Genya!" and "Mother, where are you?" work like household refrains, affirming kinship and presence. The final line turns this familiar summons into an unanswered lament. The story also records provincial gentry customs: tea on the terrace, croquet, tennis, photograph albums, holiday visits, subscriptions for fire victims, and discussion of marriage. These rituals preserve community and hierarchy together. Genya interprets photographs through uncle and godfather, converting images into oral genealogy. Kinship becomes meaningful through naming, while godfather recalls ritual relations created by baptism. The narrator's mention of wearing out iron shoes like the girl in the fairy tale invokes a direct quest motif. Iron footwear symbolizes impossible endurance. He uses it jokingly to describe devotion to Lida, but the image exposes the gap between imagined heroism and actual perseverance. He can cite folktale labor while failing to cross the smaller barrier of family opposition. Falling stars carry collective belief as well. Genya avoids looking at them because they frighten her, suggesting popular associations with souls, death, omens, or dangerous wishes. Chekhov leaves the belief undefined, preserving the half-conscious way folklore operates. The omen remains emotionally powerful without doctrinal explanation. Under falling stars, love begins already shadowed by loss. The fable dictated by Lida, God sent a crow a piece of cheese, adds popular literary tradition. Reduced to a mechanical school exercise, the familiar animal fable contrasts with the narrator's private catastrophe. Its moralizing clarity accompanies a moment when life refuses clear morals. The repeated phrase becomes an absurd refrain beside Genya's disappearance. Chekhov finally reshapes the lost maiden motif. Genya vanishes, her location becomes unknown, and the narrator turns her into an absent figure awaited across time. Unlike a folktale hero, he undertakes no quest. He preserves her through longing rather than action. The closing question echoes the mother and daughter's calls, but receives no answer. Folklore thus offers symbols for healing, kinship, duty, fear, love, and loss, while the old narrative promise of reunion quietly fails. Finally, here are several companion works worth reading. Ivan Turgenev's Fathers and Sons is an especially illuminating companion because it also places ideological conflict within country house intimacy. Bazarov's radical materialism, like the narrator's sweeping critique of reform, tests the relation between abstract conviction and the claims of particular lives. Turgenev's novel likewise shows how pride, love, mortality, and generational misunderstanding expose the limits of intellectual systems. George Eliot's Middlemarch offers a broader examination of imperfect reform. Dorothea Brooke and Tertius Lydgate pursue elevated purposes, but discover that moral action takes place through compromised institutions, mixed motives, and resistant social structures. Read beside Chekhov, the novel deepens the question of whether partial good should be rejected because it cannot abolish suffering at its roots. Thomas Hardy's The Woodlanders provides a powerful parallel in its treatment of rural custom, frustrated love, social hierarchy, and lives shaped by hesitation as much as by external circumstance. Its landscape is not merely background, but a repository of memory and communal pattern, much like the avenues, fields, pond, and estate at Shalkovka. Both works transform missed possibilities into enduring emotional climates. Leo Tolstoy's Resurrection is relevant for its relentless inquiry into privilege, responsibility, institutional charity, and the moral danger of substituting ideas for genuine accountability. Its protagonist attempts to convert remorse into action, making the novel a useful counterpoint to Chekhov's narrator, whose self-knowledge remains largely contemplative. Selma Lagerlof's Gösta Berling's saga offers a contrasting use of folklore, legend, seasonal ritual, and enchanted landscape. Its extravagant storytelling makes visible the communal myths that Chekhov keeps subdued beneath realist surfaces. Reading the two together reveals how folk motifs can either openly govern a narrative world or survive as faint echoes within modern memory. Finally, Edith Wharton's The House of Mirth complements Chekhov's story through its concern with constrained choice, social authority, lost chances, and the retrospective pain of lives that might have taken another course. Although its setting is urban and cosmopolitan, it shares Chekhov's understanding that fate is often produced by convention, pride, timing, and failures of courage rather than by supernatural necessity.